Klondike River Valley, Yukon Territory. October 1897. While thousands rushed north chasing gold, one Swedish prospector made a decision that would mark him as either a genius or a fool. Lars Henriksen arrived late in the season with his wife Ingrid and two young daughters, facing a winter that veteran miners knew could kill the unprepared. But instead of following established camp protocols, he did something that made experienced prospectors shake their heads in disbelief. He dug a pit, 4 feet deep, and set his canvas tent halfway into the frozen ground. "That man's going to freeze his family to death," declared Thomas Wardell, a 5-year mining veteran. "Cold sinks. Every fool knows that." Others were less polite. They called it a suicide shelter, a greenhorn's grave. Some refused to camp within sight of it, unwilling to witness the inevitable tragedy. But what did this former shipwright from Gothenburg understand about thermodynamics that men who'd survived multiple Yukon winters had missed? Before we reveal the engineering principle that would save the Henriksen family when temperatures plunged to levels that killed others, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Because what you're about to learn could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe in extreme cold. And we've got dozens more forgotten survival techniques to share with those who join us. The winter of 1897 to 98 would become known as the cruelest in Klondike history. And it would prove that sometimes the difference between wisdom and foolishness is simply a matter of temperature. Lars Henriksen's reputation as a fool was established before he drove the first stake. He'd arrived at Bonanza Creek on October 3rd, 1897, nearly 2 months behind the main wave of prospectors. Snow already dusted the higher elevations. Experienced miners were finishing reinforced log cabins, banking earth against walls, stockpiling firewood by the cord. The Henriksen family had a 12 by 14-foot canvas wall tent, an axe, a saw, and a plan that violated every principle of frontier shelter construction. "You're putting your tent in a hole?" Samuel Morrison asked, watching Lars mark out a rectangle with stakes. Morrison had built 17 mining camps across 3 territories. His incredulity wasn't polite concern. It was genuine alarm. "Cold air's heavier than warm air, son. It sinks. You're literally digging a cold trap." Lars continued measuring. 4 feet, 6 inches deep. Exactly. He'd calculated it 3 times during the river journey north. "And canvas?" Morrison pressed. "Canvas doesn't hold heat. That's why we use logs, chink tight. You need mass, insulation, something to stop the wind. You're making a fabric-covered pit." Thomas Wardell, whose cabin already featured double walls packed with moss, was more direct. "I've seen men freeze 2 feet from a roaring fire. You think a tent in a ditch is going to protect 2 little girls when it hits 40 below? 60 below?" He spat into the dirt. "This is negligence, not pioneering." But Lars had studied something the others hadn't. In Gothenburg, he'd worked on ships that sailed Arctic routes. He'd seen Norwegian sod houses, Icelandic turf homes. More importantly, he'd read a geological survey report on permafrost thermal properties. While others saw frozen ground as an enemy, Lars understood it as the most stable thermal mass available. His excavation revealed the principle immediately. At 4 feet depth, the soil temperature held steady near 32 degrees Fahrenheit, even when surface air plunged far below zero. This wasn't frozen solid permafrost. This was the transitional layer where Earth's geothermal stability met winter's assault. A constant, predictable baseline. The tent itself was his second innovation. He didn't simply stake it over the pit. He built a timber frame, spruce poles, for inches thick, creating an interior scaffold that elevated the canvas walls 8 inches above the pit's earthen sides. This created a dead air space, an insulation gap that would trap warmth radiated from the soil while preventing direct contact that could cause condensation freezing. Then he did something that made Morrison actually laugh. He requested help moving rocks, hundreds of them, ranging from 20 to 60 pounds each, into the pit bottom before laying his floorboards. "You're adding thermal mass," Morrison said slowly, the mockery draining from his voice as he began to understand. "You're building a heat sink." Rock holds warmth longer than wood, Lars replied in his careful English. Soil around holds temperature steady. Canvas, an air gap, keeps wind out. We heat rocks during day, they give warmth all night. Wardell wasn't convinced. And when moisture from your breath, your cooking, your body's condenses on that canvas in -60 cold, you'll have ice walls an inch thick. You'll suffocate in your own frozen exhalations. Lars had an answer for that, too. He'd position ventilation flaps at precise angles, creating convection currents that would exhaust moisture-laden air while drawing in minimal fresh air, just enough for breathing, not enough to destroy the thermal envelope. He learned the technique from Swedish military winter manuals. By October 24th, the Henriksen pit tent was complete. It looked absurd, a canvas roof barely 3 feet above ground level, most of the structure hidden below the surface like an iceberg in reverse. The stovepipe emerged at an odd angle, suggesting cramped, inefficient interior space. 43 prospectors and their families had established camp within a 2-mile radius. 17 had proper log cabins. 22 had reinforced canvas tents on elevated wooden platforms, the accepted best practice for late-season arrivals. 4 had dugout shelters carved into hillsides, considered desperate but viable. And then there was the Henriksen hole. Give them 2 weeks, predicted James Hutchins, whose double-walled cabin boasted a stone fireplace he'd spent 3 weeks constructing. First serious cold snap. They'll be begging for space in a real shelter. Morrison was less generous with his timeline. First night below -20, that tent will be a death trap. Mark my words. The temperature on October 24th was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Comfortable. Deceptive. The kind of weather that made newcomers think Yukon winters were exaggerated frontier tales. Lars Henriksen stoked his small sheet metal stove and began heating the rocks beneath his floorboards. His wife, Ingrid, arranged their belongings in the surprisingly spacious interior. The excavation had created more headroom than a standard tent, with the canvas peak a full 7 feet above the rock floor. His daughters, Astrid and Greta, ages 6 and 8, seemed enchanted by the underground house. Outside, veterans like Wardell checked their firewood supplies and reinforced their structures. They'd survived Yukon winters before. They knew what was coming. None of them knew just how severe the test would be. What Lars Henriksen understood, and what his critics fundamentally missed, was that cold isn't a substance that flows into spaces. It's the absence of heat. And in extreme environments, preventing heat loss matters far more than generating heat. The standard mining camp tent of 1897 operated on a simple, flawed principle: generate enough heat to overcome continuous loss. A canvas wall, even doubled, provided minimal insulation, roughly R 0.8 in modern terms. Wind at 20 miles per hour could strip heat through fabric faster than a small stove could replace it. Men burned through a quarter cord of wood per day, feeding fires constantly, and still woke to frost on the inside of their tent walls. Elevated platforms, considered best practice, actually worsened the problem. They exposed the tent floor to wind from all sides, creating convective cooling from below. A man might roast his face near the stove while his feet went numb on frozen floorboards. The temperature gradient from ceiling to floor could span 40 degrees. Lars had calculated a different approach entirely. Soil, at 4 feet depth in the Yukon, maintains a relatively constant temperature, hovering near 32 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of surface conditions. This isn't warmth in any comfortable sense, but it's stability. A baseline that doesn't plunge with every Arctic air mass. In thermodynamic terms, the Earth was providing a massive heat reservoir that buffered against extreme temperature swings. His excavation accomplished 3 things simultaneously. First, it lowered the living space into this stable thermal zone, reducing the temperature differential his stove had to overcome. Second, it protected the shelter from wind, the single greatest heat thief in Arctic conditions. A tent on the surface faced full wind assault on all sides. A pit tent presented minimal profile. Wind passed over it, not through it. Third, and most ingeniously, the excavation walls themselves became thermal mass. For feet of earth on all sides, each cubic yard weighing approximately 2,400 pounds, possessed enormous heat capacity. Unlike air, which heats and cools rapidly, soil changes temperature slowly. Once stabilized, it resists change, acting as both insulation and thermal battery. But the rocks beneath his floorboards were Lars's true innovation. He'd arranged 840 pounds of granite and quartzite in a layer 8 inches deep, then built his wooden floor with 1-inch gaps between planks. During daylight hours, his small stove, consuming perhaps 1/8 the wood of a standard tent stove, would heat these rocks. Granite's specific heat capacity allowed it to store roughly 0.2 BTUs per pound per degree Fahrenheit. Those 840 pounds, heated from 32 degrees Fahrenheit to 120 degrees Fahrenheit over 6 hours of burning, would store approximately 14,800 BTUs. Released slowly overnight through radiation and conduction, this represented 8 to 10 hours of gentle, sustained warmth, equivalent to a continuous small fire, but requiring no fuel, no tending, no risk of the stove going out while the family slept. The air gap between canvas and earth walls, 8 inches of still air, provided additional insulation. Still air is one of nature's best insulators, with an R value of roughly 1.0 per inch when properly trapped. His 8-inch gap, if it remained truly still, could provide our 8 insulation value, 10 times better than single-layer canvas. The ventilation system addressed what should have been a fatal flaw. Humans exhale roughly 200 milliliters of water vapor per hour through breathing alone. Cooking adds more. In a sealed tent at sub-zero temperatures, this moisture would indeed condense and freeze on every cold surface, eventually creating an ice shell that could suffocate inhabitants or collapse the structure. Lars positioned 2 ventilation flaps, one low on the south wall, one high on the north slope of the roof. Cold air, being denser, would enter the low vent. Warm air, heated by bodies and stove, would rise and exit through the high vent. But he'd sized these openings precisely, just large enough to exchange air at roughly 0.3 air changes per hour, enough to prevent dangerous CO2 buildup and excessive humidity, but slow enough to retain warmth. This convective loop would exhaust moisture-laden air before it could condense significantly, while the incoming fresh air, though cold, represented a minimal heat loss compared to the alternative of ice accumulation. Samuel Morrison, watching Lars explain this to a skeptical group on October 29th, had actually begun to reconsider his mockery. You're saying the earth is your furnace wall, the rocks are your heat storage, and the tent is just weather protection? Tent keeps wind and snow out, Lars confirmed. Earth holds temperature steady. Rocks give warmth at night. Small fire during day heats rocks and keeps family comfortable. System balances itself. Thomas Wardell remained unconvinced. Theory is fine. Reality is 40 below, 60 below, wind that'll strip the skin off your face. Your little system might work in October. Wait until January. He pointed to his own cabin. Double log walls, 12 inches apart, packed with moss and clay. Stone fireplace with a firebox I can burn logs 3 feet long. For cords it would stacked outside. That's how you survive Yukon winter. Not with rocks in a hole. But James Hutchins, the engineer who'd built the elaborate stone fireplace, asked the question that mattered. What's your target interior temperature? 40 degrees, Lars said. Maybe 45. The group actually laughed. 40 degrees? In a Yukon winter? That's barely above freezing, Morrison said. You'll be miserable. Lars shrugged. Is warm enough to sleep, to eat, to live. Use as little wood. Can maintain for months. Your cabin at 60, 70 degrees. How long you would last. Wardell's expression shifted slightly. He'd already calculated that his 4 cords might last until February if he was careful. Then he'd need to venture out in potentially lethal cold to harvest more or start rationing heat. 40 degrees sustained beats 60 degrees for 6 weeks, followed by freezing, Hutchins admitted slowly. But this was still all theory. Comfortable October days with temperatures in the 20s and low 30s. The real test required real cold. The kind of cold that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground. The kind that made experienced men question whether they'd survive to see spring. That test was coming. November's weather brought the first serious cold snaps, stretches of -10, -20 degrees. The Henriksen tent performed exactly as Lars had calculated. Interior temperatures held between 38 degrees Fahrenheit and 48 degrees Fahrenheit, with 4 hours of morning fire and 2 hours of evening burning. The rocks radiated gentle warmth through the night. The family slept comfortably under wool blankets, never approaching the desperate huddling and constant fire tending required in surface tents. Morrison, whose elevated tent required feeding the stove every 2 hours through the night just to keep the temperature above freezing, began to wonder if the Swede wasn't quite as foolish as he'd seemed. But November wasn't January, and January 1898 would bring cold that would kill unprepared men and vindicate others. The question was, which category would Lars Henriksen fall into? December 31st, 1897. Temperature at dawn, -32 degrees Fahrenheit. The barometric pressure began dropping at 9 a.m., a subtle shift that veteran prospectors recognized immediately. James Hutchins, checking his mercury barometer, watched the needle fall from 30.2 to 29.8 in less than 3 hours. Arctic front, he announced to anyone within earshot. Big one, maybe the biggest yet. By noon, a peculiar stillness had settled over Bonanza Creek. The usual wind, constant, bitter, but manageable, died completely. The silence felt oppressive, expectant. Dogs whined and pressed close to their shelters. Ravens disappeared from the sky. Thomas Wardell, who'd survived 6 Yukon winters, began hauling additional firewood inside his cabin. Not the usual day supply. Everything he could fit. He filled every pot and container with water before it froze solid. He checked his ventilation flues, made sure his stovepipe joints were tight, and prepared for what his instincts told him was coming. Storm this quiet means storm this violent, he muttered to Samuel Morrison. We're in for it. The first snowflakes appeared at 2:17 p.m. Within 20 minutes, visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. But it wasn't the snow that defined this storm. It was the cold that rode in behind it. Temperature at 3 p.m., -41 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperature at 4 p.m., -48 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperature at 5 p.m., -54 degrees Fahrenheit. And it kept falling. The wind arrived at sunset, not gradually, but like a physical blow. Gusts that hit 40 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally, finding every gap in every structure. The sound was indescribable, a shrieking, roaring fury that made normal conversation impossible even inside shelters. Lars Henriksen, checking his makeshift thermometer at 6 p.m., recorded -58 degrees Fahrenheit. He'd stoked his small stove for 3 hours that afternoon, heating his rock thermal mass to its maximum capacity. Now he let the fire die to coals, conserving his modest wood supply. His calculations suggested the rocks would maintain livable temperatures for at least 8 hours, possibly 12. Ingrid had prepared a hot meal before the worst hit: salt pork, beans, and hardtack boiled into a thick stew. The family ate in the dim light of a single oil lamp, the canvas walls barely moving despite the maelstrom outside. The excavated shelter sat below the main force of the wind, which screamed overhead but didn't penetrate their refuge. Interior temperature at 8 p.m., 43 degrees Fahrenheit. Comfortable enough that the girls played quietly with rag dolls while Ingrid mended clothing. Lars monitored the ventilation flaps, ensuring the convective loop continued working. Cold air entering low, warm air exiting high, moisture escaping before it could condense and freeze. 200 yards away, in his elevated canvas tent, Samuel Morrison was fighting for survival. Despite a roaring fire in his sheet metal stove, interior temperature hovered around 18 degrees Fahrenheit. The canvas walls popped and snapped in the wind like rifle shots. Frost accumulated on every interior surface: walls, ceiling, his blankets, even his beard. He fed the stove constantly, burning through wood at an alarming rate. Yet his feet remained numb and his water bucket froze solid despite sitting 3 feet from a stove. The temperature differential was brutal. His face, turned toward the stove, felt scorched. His back, facing the tent wall, felt the bite of cold that seeped through the canvas like it wasn't there. He'd wrapped himself in every blanket he owned and was still shivering. By 10 p.m., he knew his wood wouldn't last. At this consumption rate, he had perhaps 18 hours of fuel. After that, he'd have to venture into the storm, where the temperature had now dropped to minus 64 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill pushing it toward minus 90 degrees Fahrenheit to reach his outdoor wood pile. Or he'd have to abandon his tent and seek shelter elsewhere. In his double-walled log cabin, Thomas Wardell was faring better, but not well. Interior temperature, 52 degrees Fahrenheit, maintained by burning logs continuously in his stone fireplace. The cabin was tight, well-built, properly chinked. But those double walls, each 6 inches of spruce logs, were being assaulted by cold that penetrated deeper with every hour. Frost crept across the inside of the windows he'd so carefully fitted. The logs themselves groaned and cracked as moisture within them froze and expanded. He could feel cold radiating from the walls despite the roaring fire. His carefully stockpiled 4 cords of wood, meant to last until March, was being consumed at triple his projected rate. Before you continue this story, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Because what happens next, the measurements taken during the worst of this storm, will reveal exactly why Lars Henriksen's foolish design proved to be frontier engineering genius. And we've got dozens more of these forgotten survival techniques waiting for you. Drop a comment telling us the coldest temperature you've ever experienced, and let's see how it compares to what these prospectors endured. The storm intensified through the night. January 1st, 1898, 2 a.m., minus 67 degrees Fahrenheit. James Hutchins, in his elaborate cabin with the stone fireplace, discovered that his ventilation system, carefully designed to exhaust smoke, was now pulling precious heat out faster than his fire could generate it. He partially blocked the flue, risking carbon monoxide buildup, because the alternative was freezing. At 4 a.m., the temperature reached minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind gusts hit 52 miles per hour. The combination created an effective temperature approaching minus 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold that could cause frostbite and expose skin within 90 seconds. Cold that could kill an unprotected human in less than 10 minutes. 3 prospectors in inadequate shelters made the decision to abandon their positions and seek refuge in better structures. 2 made it, suffering severe frostbite in the 50-yard journey. The third, disoriented in the wide-out conditions, wandered in the wrong direction and wasn't found until spring thaw revealed his body 200 yards from safety. Inside the Henriksen pit tent at 4 a.m., the interior temperature read 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Lars added a single log to the stove, not because they were cold, but because he wanted to maintain the rock thermal mass for the next night, and he didn't know how long the storm would last. The small fire burned for 90 minutes, raising interior temperature to 47 degrees Fahrenheit, recharging the stones beneath the floor. Astrid and Greta slept soundly under wool blankets. Ingrid dozed fitfully, woken occasionally by the muffled roar of wind passing over their shelter. Lars monitored the ventilation, watching for any sign of ice accumulation that might block the airflow. The convective loop continued working perfectly. Warm, moist air rising and exiting, fresh cold air entering and warming as it descended into the living space. The rock thermal mass radiated steady heat. The earth walls, now holding a stable temperature around 30 degrees Fahrenheit, prevented the brutal exterior cold from penetrating. The air gap between canvas and earth provided insulation. The below-ground position protected them from wind. Every element of Lars's design was performing exactly as he'd calculated on those long river journey north. At 7 a.m., as gray dawn barely penetrated the storm, Samuel Morrison made a desperate decision. His wood was nearly exhausted, his tent was approaching interior temperatures that would soon become lethal, and he could no longer feel his feet. He bundled himself in every piece of clothing he owned, wrapped a scarf around his face, leaving only his eyes exposed, and stepped out into the maelstrom. He lasted 43 seconds before the cold drove him back inside, gasping, his exposed eyes already burning from the wind and cold. His woodpile was only 15 yards away. It might as well have been 15 miles. He built up his fire with the last of his interior supply and prepared to wait. Either the storm would break, or someone would come looking for survivors. Those were his only options now. The blizzard continued unabated through January 1st. Temperature never rose above minus 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind never dropped below 35 miles per hour. Snow accumulated in drifts that buried anything less than 4 feet tall. The Henriksen tent, with its low profile, disappeared entirely under the drifting snow, which turned out to be another advantage Lars hadn't fully anticipated. The snow provided additional insulation, creating an air pocket between canvas and snow that further buffered against the cold. By the evening of January 2nd, 72 hours into the storm, the situation across Bonanza Creek mining camp was becoming desperate. Morrison wasn't alone in running low on accessible wood. For other canvas tent dwellers were in similar straits. Even cabin dwellers like Wardell were burning through supplies at unsustainable rates. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm broke. January 3rd, 8 a.m. The wind died. The snow stopped. The temperature, impossibly, dropped even further, minus 73 degrees Fahrenheit in the still, clear air. But at least men could now venture out, assess damage, and help neighbors who might be in trouble. Thomas Wardell was the first to check on the Henriksen family. He'd seen no smoke from their chimney for nearly 12 hours and feared the worst. The tent was completely buried. He dug through 3 feet of snow to reach the entrance flap. What he found inside stopped him cold. Lars Henriksen looked up from a book he was reading to his daughters and smiled. "Got more gone, Thomas. Coffee." The interior temperature was 41 degrees Fahrenheit. The family was comfortable, dressed in normal indoor winter clothing, not the desperate layering of someone fighting hypothermia. The small stove held only embers. No active fire had burned for at least 6 hours. Wardell stood in the entrance, snow cascading off his heavy furs, and simply stared. His own cabin, with its double walls and stone fireplace, was currently 47 degrees Fahrenheit, and that was with a fire he'd been feeding constantly for 3 straight days. He burned through nearly half a cord of wood. "Ow!" was all he could manage. Lars gestured to the floor. "Rock's still warm. Touch." Wardell knelt and placed his hand on the floorboards. Gentle heat radiated upward, not hot, but noticeably warmer than ambient temperature. "Your rocks, they've been holding heat for 3 days. I fire stove too, maybe 3 hours yesterday morning. 2 hours day before. Rocks store heat, give back slowly." Lars tapped his makeshift thermometer. Never below 38 degrees inside, even in worse cold. Wardell did the math in his head. 5 hours of burning over 72 hours. Maybe 1/8 of a cord consumed. His cabin had used 6 times that amount to achieve only marginally better interior temperatures. "The earth walls," he said slowly, beginning to understand. "They're not stealing heat. They're stabilizing it." "Exactly so," Lars confirmed. "Earth at this depth, always near freezing point. Not warm, but not minus 70 either. Earth has, how you say, thermal mass? Takes much energy to change temperature. Outside air changes fast. Up, down, very cold. Earth stays steady." Samuel Morrison arrived minutes later, looking haggard. He'd survived by burning furniture and was preparing to abandon his tent. The contrast with the Henriksen family was stark. Morrison's face showed the beginning of frostbite on his cheeks. His movements were slow and deliberate, signs of mild hypothermia. The Henriksen girls were playing a game with pebbles, completely comfortable. "Measure it," Morrison said flatly. "I need to see the numbers." They conducted a systematic survey over the next 2 hours as other prospectors gathered. Lars had kept meticulous records, partly from engineering habit, partly because he'd known he'd need to prove his methods if they worked. Henriksen pit tent, 72-hour performance, exterior temperature range, minus 32 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 73 degrees Fahrenheit interior temperature range. 38 degrees Fahrenheit to 47 degrees Fahrenheit total wood consumed. Approximately 0.15 cords, 120 pounds. Burning hours, 8 hours total, spread across 3 days. Average interior temperature, 42 degrees Fahrenheit temperature stability. Plus or minus 5 degrees Fahrenheit maximum variation, no frost accumulation on interior surfaces, no condensation or ice formation. Ventilation system functioned continuously. Family health excellent, no cold-related injuries. For comparison, James Hutchins provided data from his stone fireplace cabin. Hutchins cabin, 72-hour performance. Exterior temperature range. Identical interior temperature range. 45 degrees Fahrenheit to 61 degrees Fahrenheit total wood consumed. Approximately 0.8 cords, 640 pounds. Burning hours. Continuous, 72 hours. Average interior temperature, 54 degrees Fahrenheit temperature stability. Plus or minus 8 degrees Fahrenheit maximum variation. Moderate frost on windows. Significant heat loss through ventilation. Family health good. Minor frostbite on one child's fingers. Wardell's double-wall cabin showed similar numbers. Roughly 0.7 cords burned. Interior temperatures averaging 51 degrees Fahrenheit. Morrison's elevated tent had been a near disaster. Approximately 0.4 cords consumed before supply. Exhausted. Interior temperatures dropping to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. When fire died, severe frost accumulation on all interior surfaces. Morrison suffering early-stage hypothermia and frostbite. The engineering implications were stunning. Lars had maintained livable temperatures using 1/5 to 1/6 the fuel of conventional shelters. His temperature stability was superior. The thermal mass system damped temperature swings that made other shelters alternately too hot or too cold. And his family had been genuinely comfortable while others had merely survived. But it was Morrison who asked the crucial question, that rock thermal mass. How much heat is it actually storing? Lars had done the calculations. 840 pounds of granite rock. I heat from maybe 32 degrees to about 120 degrees. Specific heat of granite is about 0.2 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. So, he worked the numbers on a scrap of paper. About 14,800 BTU stored. Hutchins, the engineer, nodded slowly. And you're releasing that over, 10 hours? 8 to 12 hours, depending on outside temperature. Slow release. Radiant heat through floor. Some convection warming the air. Very efficient because it's gentle. Not trying to fight -70 air directly, just maintaining comfortable temperature in stable envelope. The earth walls are doing most of the actual insulation work, Hutchins realized. They're not perfect insulators, but they're massive heat sinks that resist temperature change. You're not heating against -70. You're heating against the earth temperature, which is what? Around 32. Exactly. Earth creates stable boundary. I only heat the small difference, from 32 to 42 degrees. 10-degree difference. Your cabin heats against full exterior temperature. 70, 80-degree difference. The thermodynamic elegance was becoming clear. While surface structures battled the full fury of Arctic air, Lars's pit tent existed in a microclimate buffered by billions of pounds of earth maintaining relatively constant temperature. Thomas Wardell, who 3 months earlier had declared the pit tent a suicide shelter, sat heavily on a log. I called you a fool. Many people did, Lars said without rancor. You've burned 1/6 of what I have. We're not even halfway through winter. I'm going to run out by February at this rate. You could probably make it to spring with what you have stockpiled. Maybe, Lars acknowledged. But also I can go out in -40, -50, get more wood, come back. My shelter holds temperature. Takes hours to cool. I can work outside, come back to warmth. Your cabin, if fire goes out for 2 hours in this cold, how long to warm again? Wardell had to admit the truth. Hours. Maybe half a day to get back to comfortable with everything frozen. Morrison was taking notes. The ventilation system. You're pulling moisture out without pulling heat out. Slow air exchange. Just enough. Cold air comes in low here, south side. Warms as it enters. Rises. Warm air exits high. Here, north side. Takes moisture with it. But only 0.3, maybe 0.4 air changes per hour. Enough to breathe, not enough to lose much heat. And the snow covering everything. That helped? Accident, but yes. Snow is insulation also. Created air pocket between canvas and snow. Maybe R3, R4 additional insulation value. The gathered prospectors were silent for a long moment, absorbing the implications. This wasn't just a survival technique. It was a fundamental rethinking of how to exist in extreme cold with minimal resources. James Hutchins finally spoke what others were thinking. We've been trying to create summer indoors in the middle of winter. You created a stable spring, just warm enough, sustainable indefinitely. Spring is enough, Lars said simply. You don't need 70 degrees to live. You need above freezing, dry, wind protected. The rest is, how you say, luxury that costs too much wood. By midday on January 3rd, every prospector in the camp had visited the Henriksen pit tent. Some came skeptical, checking for hidden tricks or advantages Lars hadn't disclosed. They found none. It was exactly what it appeared to be, a canvas tent in an excavated pit, with rock thermal mass below the floor and earth walls providing stable insulation. That evening, as temperatures remained at minus 68 degrees Fahrenheit, Samuel Morrison began digging his own pit. He had no choice. His tent was untenable, and his only hope was to replicate Lars's design before the next storm hit. Thomas Wardell helped him, as did 6 others who recognized that their current shelters, while survivable, were consuming resources at rates that might not last until spring. But it was James Hutchins who articulated what the storm had proven. We brought our assumptions north with us. Assumptions about what shelter should look like, how heat should be generated, what comfort requires. Lars didn't bring assumptions. He brought calculations. The temperature on January 4th was minus 61 degrees Fahrenheit. On January 5th, minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit. The deep cold would persist for another 2 weeks, though without the blizzard conditions that had made the first storm so deadly. By January 8th, 1898, 11 pit tents were under construction in Bonanza Creek mining camp. Not exact copies. Each prospector adapted the concept to their situation, materials, and family size. But the core principles were the same. Excavate below wind and in a stable earth temperature. Maximize thermal mass. Minimize air exchange. Create insulation through air gaps and earth walls. The transformation wasn't universal. Some prospectors, heavily invested in expensive cabins or convinced that their methods were superior, refused to adapt. But among those who'd felt winter's bite and calculated how long their supplies would last, Lars Henriksen's foolish pit tent suddenly represented frontier wisdom. The question now was whether this was a one-time success or a genuinely replicable technique. Whether Lars had gotten lucky or had genuinely understood something fundamental about surviving extreme cold with minimal resources. Spring would provide the final answer. Spring breakup came late in 1898, mid-May before the ice on Bonanza Creek finally surrendered to sun and current. By then, the winter's toll was known. 23 prospectors and family members had died across the Klondike, most from cold-related causes. Frostbite had claimed fingers, toes, and in 2 cases, entire feet. Scurvy had stalked the camps, and with supplies had proven more critical than gold-finding equipment. But within the 2-mile radius of Bonanza Creek, where Lars Henriksen had built his pit tent, the statistics told a different story. 0 deaths, minimal frostbite, mostly superficial cases from brief exposure during necessary outdoor work. And every shelter that had adopted pit or semi-subterranean design had made it through with wood to spare. Samuel Morrison's converted pit tent, hastily dug in early January and continuously improved through the winter, had used approximately 1.8 cords of wood from January through April. His original elevated tent design, extrapolated across the same period, would have required nearly 7 cords. He'd saved himself and his family not just from cold, but from the desperate, dangerous necessity of harvesting wood in lethal temperatures. Thomas Wardell, who'd maintained his double-wall cabin but added earth banking and thermal mass principles, cut his wood consumption by 40%. More importantly, the stable temperatures meant his family suffered none of the respiratory illnesses that plagued many camps. The constant temperature swings between overheated and freezing common in conventional shelters had been eliminated. The most dramatic success story wasn't the Henriksen family. Their survival was expected given Lars's careful engineering. It was the Morrison family, whose shelter had been on the edge of failure before the conversion. Morrison's youngest daughter, who'd suffered frostbite to her fingers during the January blizzard in the old tent, showed complete recovery by spring. In a conventional shelter requiring constant fire tending, those fingers might have been lost. But success in engineering terms required more than survival. It required measurement, replication, and understanding of principles. As spring progressed and prospectors had time to reflect, a systematic understanding of why the pit tent worked began to emerge. James Hutchins, trained in engineering at a time when thermodynamics was becoming a formal science, conducted the most thorough analysis. He kept detailed records through the winter, temperatures, wood consumption, heat transfer observations. His conclusions, shared in a report that would eventually make its way to mining journals, were clear. Principle 1. Earth as thermal buffer at 4 feet depth in permafrost regions. Soil temperature remains relatively constant, varying only 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit seasonally versus 100+ degree F surface variation. This creates a stable baseline that requires minimal energy to maintain habitable temperatures. Principle 2. Wind protection. Subterranean or semi-subterranean structures remove the single largest heat loss mechanism, convective cooling from wind. A 40 miles per hour wind can increase heat loss by 400% compared to still air. Pitch shelters simply remove this variable. Principle 3. Thermal mass heat storage. Rock, soil, and dense materials store heat far more effectively than air. 840 pounds of rock can store enough heat to maintain comfortable temperatures for 10 to 12 hours without active heating, equivalent to burning wood continuously, but without resource consumption or fire risk. Principle 4. Minimal air exchange. While ventilation is necessary for breathing and moisture control, excessive air exchange wastes heat. Optimizing to 0.3 to 0.4 air changes per hour provides adequate fresh air while minimizing heat loss, compared to poorly sealed surface structures experiencing 2 to 3 air changes per hour or more in windy conditions. Hutchins calculated that Lars's pit tent, operating through the winter, had achieved an effective R value, thermal resistance, of approximately R28 to R32, comparable to modern well-insulated homes. This was accomplished not through advanced materials, but through intelligent use of earth, air gaps, and thermal mass. A conventional double-wall log cabin achieved perhaps R12 to R15. Elevated canvas tents were effectively R2 to R3. The fuel efficiency followed directly from these numbers. To maintain a 40 degrees Fahrenheit temperature differential against minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit exterior, R3 tent. Massive continuous heat input required R15 cabin. Substantial continuous heating needed R30 pit tent. Minimal intermittent heating sufficient, but perhaps most important was the social proof. By spring of 1898, the pit tent was no longer Lars Henriksen's foolish experiment. It was becoming standard practice for late-season arrivals and those with limited wood access. 17 variations have been built around Bonanza Creek alone. Some combined earth shelter design with log construction. Others used the pit concept for food storage cellars that maintain near-freezing temperatures year-round, critical for meat preservation. Still others incorporated rock thermal mass into conventional cabins, adding heat storage without full excavation. The technique spread through the mechanism. All frontier innovations spread. Word of mouth, survival necessity, and demonstrated results. By summer 1898, prospectors heading into new territories carried knowledge of earth-sheltered, thermal mass-enhanced shelter design. Some would use it, others would dismiss it, but the option existed, proven by the Henriksen family's comfortable winter in a half-buried tent. On May 23, 1898, With breakup complete and the first riverboats arriving with fresh supplies and new prospectors, Thomas Wardell sought out Lars Henriksen. He found him working his claim, the pit tent still intact and functional as spring shelter. "I owe you an apology," Wardell said without preamble. "I called your shelter a death trap. I said you were a fool who'd freeze his family. I was wrong." Lars looked up from his sluice box and shrugged. "You had reasons to think so. Every reason, based on what you knew. I had different knowledge, ships, Arctic sailing, geology reports, different tools to think with. Still, I should have been less certain of my own rightness." "Maybe," Lars agreed. "But also, you helped Morrison dig his pit in January. You could have refused, held to your belief that it wouldn't work. Instead, you saw evidence and you adapted. That is also wisdom." Wardell nodded slowly. "Morrison told me something last week. He said if he'd stayed in his elevated tent through January and February, his family wouldn't have made it. The pit tent didn't just save him money on wood. It saved their lives. Perhaps. Or perhaps he would have found another way. People are resourceful when survival depends on it. But they shouldn't have to be that desperate. Not when better methods exist." Wardell paused. "I'm writing to my brother in Nome. He's planning to establish a trading post next winter. I'm going to tell him about your design. Make sure he knows the principles, not just the surface appearance." Lars smiled. "Good. Because the design, it is not mine. Icelanders have turf houses for 1,000 years. Norwegians have sod roofs. Native peoples here, they have semi-subterranean winter houses long before any of us arrived. I just adapted old knowledge to new situation. That's what engineering is," Wardell said. "Taking what works and applying it where it's needed." The conversation was interrupted by a newcomer, a prospector fresh off the riverboat, equipped with expensive gear and confident assumptions about how Klondike mining camps should be built. He'd been asking around about winter shelter construction and had been directed to both Wardell and Henriksen as experienced survivors. "I've been told you advocate for living in holes," the man said with barely concealed condescension. "Surely that can't be the most effective approach in civilized mining operations." Wardell and Lars exchanged glances. Then Wardell smiled. "Tell you what, build your shelter however you think best this summer. Come talk to us again in February. We'll compare fuel consumption, interior temperatures, and comfort levels. Then you could decide what's civilized and what's effective." The newcomer bristled at the implied challenge, but had no ready answer. Lars simply returned to his work. He'd proven his methods to those willing to see evidence. The rest would learn their own way, through harsh experience or through the wisdom of listening to those who'd already paid the price of knowledge. By autumn 1898, the legend of the half-buried tent had spread throughout the Yukon and into Alaska. Some versions were accurate, emphasizing the thermal mass and earth-sheltering principles. Others were garbled, missing key details or adding fabrications. But the core truth remained. A Swedish shipwright with geological knowledge had kept his family alive and comfortable through one of the worst winters in Klondike history, using a fraction of the resources others consumed. It had proven that dismissing traditional knowledge, whether Scandinavian earth shelter techniques or indigenous semi-subterranean dwellings, as primitive, often revealed not their inadequacy, but our own ignorance. That sometimes the difference between foolishness and genius was simply a matter of whose assumptions proved correct when nature delivered its verdict. In that winter, nature had delivered its verdict in temperatures of -70 degrees, 3 days of blizzard, and survival that depended not on who had the most resources, but on who understood the physics of heat, earth, and endurance. The Henriksen pit tent survived that winter and 3 more. The family eventually returned to Sweden in 1902, their small fortune made not from gold strikes, but from Lars's patient, consistent work and frugal use of resources. The pit itself remained, used by various prospectors through 1907 before finally collapsing during spring thaw. But the technique lived on, adapted and refined, a small thread in the larger tapestry of frontier engineering wisdom. The accumulated knowledge of how to survive and even thrive in conditions that should have been unsurvivable. All because one man dug a hole and understood what it meant to work with nature's constants rather than fighting against them. The winter of 1897 to 98 became a dividing line in Klondike mining camp architecture, not because everyone immediately adopted pit tent designs, but because it shattered the certainty that European and American building traditions represented the only valid approaches to frontier shelter. By 1900, the principles Lars Henriksen had demonstrated were being documented in miners' guidebooks and territorial government pamphlets. The Canadian Department of the Interior, responding to the high death toll from exposure in early gold rush years, commissioned a report on effective cold-weather shelter construction. Lars's pit tent design appeared on page 12, alongside traditional log cabin construction and indigenous building methods. The report's language was telling. Semi-subterranean shelters utilizing Earth thermal mass have proven highly effective in extreme cold conditions, particularly for those with limited timber access or requiring fuel efficiency. These designs, long employed by Arctic and subarctic indigenous peoples, deserve serious consideration rather than dismissal as primitive. It was, in bureaucratic language, an acknowledgement that primitive had been a failure of understanding, not a description of inadequacy. But the deeper legacy wasn't in government reports or mining guidebooks. It was in the quiet transmission of knowledge from prospector to prospector, the kind of wisdom that saved lives without fanfare or official recognition. Samuel Morrison, whose near-death experience in the January 1898 blizzard had converted him from skeptic to advocate, became one of the technique's most effective missionaries. Over the next decade, he helped construct or advise on 43 semi-subterranean shelters across Alaska and Yukon territories. He never claimed credit for the design, always citing Lars and, when possible, tracing the principles back to their indigenous and Scandinavian origins. In 1903, Morrison encountered a Koyukon elder near the Yukon River who smiled when shown sketches of the pit tent design. "We have built this way for more winters than anyone can count," the elder said through a translator. "Your friend did not invent this. He remembered it." Morrison included that conversation in every subsequent discussion of the technique. The pit tent wasn't innovation, it was rediscovery. It was European prospectors finally paying attention to what Arctic peoples had understood for millennia, that fighting nature's extremes was less effective than working within them. The technical principles spread beyond mining camps. By 1905, the Alaska Road Commission was incorporating earth-sheltering concepts into roadhouse construction. The shelters spaced along territorial trails where travelers could find refuge. These weren't pure pit designs, but they used earth banking, thermal mass floors, and minimal ventilation principles to reduce fuel consumption while maintaining safety. One roadhouse keeper, interviewed in 1908, reported burning one-third the wood of comparable surface structures while maintaining more stable interior temperatures. "Travelers appreciate consistency," he noted. "Better to arrive at a 45-degree shelter that stays 45 degrees than a 70-degree room that drops to 30 when the fire dies while you're sleeping." The economic impact was measurable. In remote locations where every cord of wood represented hours of hard labor, fuel efficiency wasn't luxury. It was survival economics. A shelter that could maintain livability on 6 cords per winter versus 18 cords meant the difference between sustainable operation and abandonment. But perhaps the most profound legacy was what the pit tent revealed about the nature of expertise itself. Thomas Wardell, reflecting in 1910 on his initial dismissal of Lars's design, wrote in a letter to a mining journal, "I had 6 winters of Yukon experience. I had built shelters that kept me alive through brutal cold. I considered myself expert in frontier survival. Yet I nearly cost the Morrison family their lives by convincing them my way was the only way. The problem wasn't that my knowledge was wrong. Double wall cabins do work. The problem was my certainty that alternative approaches must be inferior." Lars Henriksen had different knowledge, drawn from different sources: Arctic shipping, geology, Scandinavian traditions. His expertise was as valid as mine, perhaps more so for his specific situation. True expertise, I've learned, includes knowing the boundaries of your knowledge and remaining open to evidence that challenges your assumptions. The man I called a fool taught me that lesson in the most humbling way possible, by being right when I was certain he was wrong. This intellectual humility became part of the pit tent's legacy. It wasn't just a building technique. It was a case study in how certainty could blind experts to viable solutions, how cultural assumptions could override engineering principles, and how survival sometimes depended on questioning conventional wisdom. The indigenous connection became increasingly acknowledged as years passed. Researchers documenting traditional Arctic architecture found remarkable parallels to Lars's design and structures that predated European contact by centuries. Aleutian barabaras, semi-subterranean dwellings using whale bones and sod, employed the same earth-sheltering and thermal mass principles. Athabascan winter houses incorporated below-ground excavation and careful ventilation management. Inuit Karmak structures used stone and sod in configurations that maximized heat retention while minimizing fuel needs. These weren't crude shelters built by people who didn't know better. They were sophisticated engineering solutions developed through generations of observation, experimentation, and refinement. Solutions that worked so well they remained essentially unchanged for centuries because there was no need to improve what was already optimal for the conditions. Lars Henriksen hadn't invented anything. He'd synthesized existing knowledge, Scandinavian earth-sheltering traditions, geological understanding of permafrost, and principles that paralleled indigenous Arctic architecture, and applied it to gold rush conditions. His genius was in recognition and adaptation, not creation. By 1915, the Klondike gold rush had largely ended. The easy placer deposits were exhausted, and industrial mining operations had replaced individual prospectors. But the lessons of that era persisted, encoded in the structures that dotted the landscape and in the knowledge carried by those who'd survived the harsh winters. The original Henriksen pit tent site, visited by researchers in 1920, showed clear evidence of the design's effectiveness. The excavation remained intact, protected from erosion by its below-grade position. The rock thermal mass layer, though scattered, still showed the careful size selection Lars had employed. Stones large enough for significant heat capacity, but small enough for efficient placement. Soil analysis confirmed what Lars had calculated. At 4 feet depth, temperature variation was minimal even in extreme surface conditions. The Earth had been, and remained, a stable thermal reservoir exactly as he'd understood. Modern thermal imaging, applied to similar structures in the 1980s, revealed heat distribution patterns that validated Lars's convective ventilation design. The low intake, high exhaust positioning created natural circulation that removed moisture while minimizing heat loss. A passive system requiring no mechanical components, yet functioning with remarkable efficiency. Engineering students studying the pit tent design in contemporary sustainable architecture courses learn the same principles Lars employed. Work with natural systems rather than against them. Use thermal mass to store and release heat. Minimize energy inputs through intelligent design, and respect traditional knowledge that has proven effective over time. The pit tent has become a case study not just in frontier survival, but in sustainable design philosophy. In an era concerned with energy efficiency and minimal environmental impact, a shelter built in 1897 using hand tools and local materials offers lessons about what's possible when necessity drives innovation and humility enables learning. Before we close this story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We've got dozens more forgotten survival techniques and frontier engineering wisdom waiting for you. Methods that kept people alive in conditions that should have been unsurvivable, using principles that remain relevant today. Drop a comment sharing what surprised you most about Lars Henriksen's design, and let's keep this conversation about practical wisdom alive. The final chapter in Lars Henriksen's story came in 1934, 36 years after that brutal winter. A young engineer visiting Sweden tracked down Lars, then 71 years old, living in retirement near Gothenburg. The engineer wanted to document the pit tent design for a thesis on Arctic construction methods. Lars was bemused by the attention. "I dug a hole and put a tent in it," he said through an interpreter. This is not revolutionary. This is common sense applied to specific problem. But when pressed about what he'd learned from the experience, Lars became more thoughtful. I learned that people confuse familiar with correct. My neighbors knew cabin building. They were expert in that. But they assumed cabin was only answer because it was answer they knew. I also learned to respect old knowledge. The techniques I used, earth sheltering, thermal mass, careful ventilation, these were not new. Icelanders, Norwegians, native peoples of Alaska, they knew these things for generations. I just listened when others didn't. Most important, I learned that survival is not about having most resources. It is about using resources wisely. My family was comfortable all winter on small amount of wood because we didn't waste heat fighting impossible battle against -70 air. We worked with earth, with stone, with physics. We didn't try to create summer in middle of winter. The engineer asked whether Lars felt vindicated by the widespread adoption of his methods. Vindicated? Lars shook his head. I wanted my family safe and warm. I succeeded. Others saw and learned. This is good. But I was never trying to prove something to people who call me fool. I was trying to survive winter. The men who laughed, Morrison, Wardell, the others, they learned and they adapted. Some apologized, but they didn't need to. They were wrong, but they were honest about being wrong. They changed their minds when evidence showed them they should. This is more important than being right first time. The dangerous man is the one who stays wrong even after evidence proves him wrong. That man, he will freeze to death defending his certainty. Lars Henriksen died in 1941, having lived to see his half-buried tent become a recognized component of Arctic survival knowledge. He never sought fame for the design and never profited from it beyond the personal satisfaction of keeping his family alive and comfortable through that brutal winter. But his legacy persists in every earth-sheltered home, every passive solar design, every structure that uses thermal mass and natural systems to reduce energy consumption. The specifics differ: modern materials, precise engineering, building codes, and safety standards that didn't exist in 1897. But the principles remain valid. Work with natural systems, respect traditional knowledge, and recognize that sometimes the wisest approach is the one that's been quietly working for centuries. The pit tent stands as a monument to intellectual humility, to the understanding that expertise in one domain doesn't automatically confer expertise in all domains, that traditional and indigenous knowledge deserves respect rather than dismissal, and that sometimes the person everyone calls a fool is simply the first person willing to question assumptions everyone else takes for granted. It reminds us that in survival situations, whether in Yukon blizzards or modern crises, the ability to learn, adapt, and synthesize knowledge from multiple sources can matter more than rigid adherence to conventional approaches. That creativity within constraints, resourcefulness in scarcity, and willingness to learn from unlikely teachers can make the difference between thriving and merely surviving. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches that the line between primitive and sophisticated often says more about the observer's biases than about the actual effectiveness of the technique being observed. On a hillside in the Yukon, barely visible under decades of soil and vegetation, the outline of an excavation still remains. 4 feet deep, 12 by 14 feet across, with scattered rocks that once formed a thermal mass floor. It's unmarked, unpreserved, unknown to most who pass by. But for those who know the story, it represents something profound, a moment when conventional wisdom met unconventional thinking, when extreme conditions tested both, and when the result validated not the loudest voices or the most confident experts, but the quiet engineer who understood that sometimes the best way to survive winter's fury is to dig down into the Earth's steady embrace and let physics do what physics does best. The half-buried tent kept a family alive through 70 degrees below zero because it worked with nature instead of against it, because it respected knowledge that predated European settlement, because it prioritized efficiency over appearance, function over tradition, and survival over pride, and because one Swedish prospector had the wisdom to calculate, the courage to execute, and the patience to prove that sometimes the fool isn't the one digging a hole in frozen ground. It's everyone too certain of their own expertise to consider that there might be a better way. That lesson remains as relevant now as it was in 1897, perhaps more so, in a world facing new challenges that will require us to question assumptions, synthesize knowledge across cultures and disciplines, and have the humility to learn from those we might initially dismiss. The blizzard has long passed. The prospectors are gone, but the pit remains, and the lesson endures. Educational and historical content, building codes, safety regulations, and professional consultation should be obtained before attempting any construction project. This presentation is for informational purposes and does not constitute engineering advice.